The sun was low over the red horizon when Thomas rode back toward his ranch. Dust rose behind his horse and the smell of dry earth filled the air. It had been a long day and all he wanted was to rest and have some warm coffee by the fire. The wind was getting colder as night came in, and clouds hung heavy, promising another storm before dawn. As he reached the edge of the old trail, something caught his eye. At first he thought it was just a broken wagon or an animal lying near the fence, but when he got closer, he saw a young woman sitting on the ground, her dress torn and covered in mud. She didn't move when the horse stopped in front of her. She just sat there with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the ground. Thomas climbed down slowly, his boots sinking into the wet dirt. The girl looked up, startled, as if she had not expected anyone to find her. Her face was pale under the dirt and her eyes looked tired and frightened. He could tell she had been through something hard. "You hurt, miss?" he asked softly. She didn't answer. She just shook her head and tried to stand, but her legs gave way and she fell again. Thomas quickly stepped forward and caught her before she hit the ground. She was shivering badly. Her clothes were soaked from the earlier rain. Without thinking, he took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Easy now," he said quietly. "You'll catch your death out here." He looked around but saw no horse, no wagon, no tracks except hers. "Where are you headed?" he asked again. This time she spoke in a weak voice. I don't know. My wagon broke near the creek. The others went for help, but they never came back." Thomas frowned. That area was 10 miles back. She must have walked all this way through the mud and cold. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said firmly. "Come on, you'll sleep in my house tonight. You can tell me everything after you get warm." Her eyes widened slightly at his words, maybe from surprise or worry, but she didn't argue. She just nodded slowly. He helped her onto his horse and led them toward the small ranch house that sat in a valley below the hills. The trail was rough, but the horse moved carefully and Thomas kept his arm steady around her so she wouldn't fall. When they reached the house, the lamps inside were dim and smoke rose from the chimney. He pushed open the door and guided her in. The warmth hit them both at once. His old hound lifted its head from near the fire, wagged its tail once, and went back to sleep. Thomas took off his hat and hung it near the door, then motioned toward the chair by the fire. "Sit there," he said. "You look half frozen." She hesitated before sitting, glancing around like she wasn't sure she should be there. The house was simple but clean. Wooden walls, a small table, a shelf with books, and the smell of stew still faint in the air. Thomas went to the stove, poured some water into a pot, and began to heat it. He kept glancing at her while he worked. She sat quietly, her hands trembling slightly as she held them out toward the fire. After a few minutes, he brought her a cup of warm tea and a clean towel. "Here," he said. "You can wash the mud off your face." She took the cup carefully, her fingers brushing his for a moment. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was soft, almost unsure, but it carried a kind of strength beneath the fear. He sat across from her, the chair creaking under his weight. "What's your name?" he asked after a pause. "Lydia," she said. "Lydia Moore." Thomas nodded. "I'm Thomas Hale. This place is Hale Ranch, though it's not much to look at lately." She gave a small smile, the first he had seen on her face. "It's more than I had today," she said quietly. The storm outside had begun again, the wind rattling the windows, but inside the fire crackled warm and steady. He noticed her eyes growing heavy as she sat there. "You need rest," he said. "I'll fix the spare room for you." Lydia tried to protest, saying she didn't want to trouble him, but he stopped her. "You've been through enough," he said kindly. "You're safe here." He brought out a blanket and showed her to the small guest room down the hall. It had been his sister's before she married and left for town. The bed was small but clean, with fresh sheets and a window that looked out toward the hills. "You can sleep here," Thomas said. "There's water in the bowl if you want to wash. I'll be in the next room if you need anything." She looked at him for a long moment as if trying to decide whether to trust him. Finally, she nodded again. "Thank you, Mr. Hale," she said softly, "for stopping." He just nodded and stepped out, closing the door quietly behind him. Later that night, Thomas sat near the fire thinking. He couldn't get the image of her sitting alone in the mud out of his head. Something about her face stayed with him, the look of someone who had lost everything but was still trying to stay strong. The wind howled outside and he tossed another log on the fire. He wondered what kind of danger she might be running from. The frontier wasn't kind to people who traveled alone, especially women. He thought of riding into town at first light to check if anyone was looking for her, or if there had been word of a broken wagon. But for now she was safe, and that was what mattered. In the small room, Lydia lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The warmth of the blanket and the sound of the fire in the next room made her feel safer than she had in days. She didn't know what to think of Thomas Hale, this quiet man with steady eyes and rough hands who had shown her kindness without asking anything in return. People like him were rare on the frontier. She thought about how he had found her, how easily he could have ridden past, and how his words, "You'll sleep in my house tonight," had felt less like an order and more like a promise that she wouldn't be left alone again. The night passed slowly. Outside, the storm grew stronger, but inside, the little ranch house stood firm. When Thomas finally went to his own bed, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a strange sense of peace. For so long, he had lived alone, his days filled with hard work and silence. But now, under the same roof, there was another heartbeat, another life that had crossed his path. He didn't know why fate had brought her to his land, but he had a feeling that her story wasn't just one of loss. It was the beginning of something neither of them expected. And as the first light of dawn crept over the valley, Thomas Hale made up his mind. When morning came, he would learn the truth about Lydia Moore and why she had been sitting alone on that muddy road. Morning came slow and quiet after the storm. The sky was still heavy with gray clouds, and the land outside the window glistened with rain. Thomas woke early, as he always did, but something felt different in the house. The silence was softer, not as lonely as before. He brewed coffee, the smell filling the kitchen, and set an extra cup on the table out of habit. He didn't expect Lydia to wake soon, but when he turned around, she was already standing in the doorway. Her hair was still damp, her face washed clean, and though she looked tired, there was a calm strength in her eyes now. She gave a small, shy smile. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," she said. He nodded toward the chair. "Sit, coffee's hot." She sat quietly while he poured her a cup. For a while, neither of them spoke. The rain tapped against the windows and the fire crackled low. Finally, Thomas said, "You must be hungry." He set a plate of bread and beans in front of her. She hesitated, then whispered, "I don't know how to thank you." He looked at her kindly. "You don't need to. Just eat." She smiled again and did as he said. He noticed the way her hands shook slightly as she held the cup, not from fear now, but maybe from exhaustion. After breakfast, Thomas leaned back in his chair. "I need to ride into town," he said. "If your wagon broke by the creek, maybe someone's looking for you. I'll ask around." Her eyes widened a little. "Please don't tell anyone I'm here yet," she said quickly. Thomas studied her face. "Why?" he asked. Lydia looked down, fingers twisting in her lap. "The men I was traveling with. They weren't family," she said quietly. "They said they'd take me west, find me work. But after the wagon broke, they argued. One of them wanted to leave me behind. So I left first." Thomas frowned deeply. He didn't ask for more details, but his jaw tightened. He had seen this kind of cruelty before. The frontier could turn men hard, and women like Lydia paid the price. He nodded slowly. "Then I won't say a word," he promised. "You can stay here until you figure out where you want to go." Lydia looked at him with gratitude shining in her eyes. "You don't even know me," she said softly. "Don't have to," Thomas replied. "You needed help. That's enough." The day passed with slow work around the ranch. Thomas went out to fix a broken fence, and Lydia insisted on helping. He tried to tell her to rest, but she wouldn't hear it. "I can work," she said firmly. "I've worked all my life." So he handed her lighter tasks, feeding the chickens, sweeping the porch, washing the dishes. She moved carefully but with quiet determination. Thomas found himself watching her more than once. There was something steady about her, something strong under the gentleness. By noon, the clouds began to break and sunlight spilled over the wet land. Lydia stood outside, the wind lifting her hair, her face turned toward the light. Thomas came up beside her, carrying a bucket. "Looks like the storm's done with us," he said. She smiled faintly. "Maybe," she answered. "But some storms don't end that easily." He understood what she meant but didn't push further. They stood there for a while, just listening to the sound of water dripping from the eaves and birds slowly returning to the trees. That evening, Thomas saddled his horse and rode into town for supplies. The small settlement was quiet. But as he walked into the general store, he overheard talk from two men near the counter. "You hear about that wagon trouble near the creek?" one said. "Couple of travelers got stuck. One woman went missing. They say she ran off." Thomas's hand paused on the counter. "You sure?" the storekeeper asked. "Sure as I'm standing here," the man said. "Sheriff's got folk looking." Thomas paid for his supplies quietly and left without saying much. On the ride home, his thoughts churned. If the sheriff was looking, it might mean Lydia's story wasn't complete. Or maybe those men were trying to find her for reasons she hadn't told him yet. When he reached the ranch, the lamps were glowing warm inside. Lydia was sitting near the fire, mending an old blanket. She looked up when he entered, her face lighting up with relief. "You came back," she said softly. "Of course," he replied, setting down the supplies. He studied her for a moment, then said gently, "The men from the wagon, they're saying you ran off. Sheriff's looking." Her hands froze mid-stitch. "They're looking for me," she whispered. "Do they want to hurt you?" he asked. Tears welled in her eyes, but she wiped them quickly. "They weren't good men," she said in a shaking voice. "One of them tried to sell me to a trader in the last town. When I found out, I ran. That's when the wagon broke. If they find me, they'll drag me back. Please, Mr. Hale, don't let them take me." Thomas stood silent for a long moment. Then he nodded once, firm and steady. "They won't touch you," he said quietly. "Not while you're under my roof." The next few days passed in tense calm. Lydia helped with chores and Thomas kept an eye on the road. Every evening, the two would talk a little more. She told him about her life before, the small farm she grew up on, her parents gone too soon, her dream to see the world beyond the flat plains. Thomas shared stories too, about his brother who died in a cattle drive and the years he'd spent working land that never gave much back. Slowly, a bond formed between them, built on quiet understanding and the kind of trust that doesn't need many words. One afternoon, as the sun sank low and painted the land gold, a rider appeared in the distance. Thomas saw the dust cloud first and felt his chest tighten. He told Lydia to stay inside and went out to meet the stranger. The man was rough-looking with a scar on his cheek and eyes that didn't know kindness. "Looking for a girl," he said without greeting. "Name's Lydia Moore, traveled with us and ran off." Thomas's face stayed calm. "Haven't seen anyone by that name," he said evenly. The man looked past him toward the house. "You sure about that?" he asked. "Ain't wise to hide folks you don't know." Thomas's voice turned colder. "You best be on your way. Storm's over, but the road's still bad. Wouldn't want you getting stuck." The man studied him a moment longer, then spat in the dirt. "If you see her, tell her we're coming," he said and rode off. Thomas stood watching until the rider disappeared behind the ridge. When he went back inside, Lydia was standing by the window, pale and trembling. "He saw the house," she said. "He'll come back." Thomas placed his hat on the table. "Then he'll find out this land isn't as empty as it looks," he replied quietly. That night, neither of them slept much. Thomas sat by the fire with his rifle across his knees, not because he wanted trouble, but because he wouldn't let harm come through his door. Lydia came out once and handed him a cup of tea. "You shouldn't stay up all night," she said softly. He gave a small smile. "I've been alone long enough to know when something's worth losing sleep for." She looked at him, her eyes full of gratitude, then turned away before tears could fall. Morning came bright and clear again. No riders appeared, no danger came. Maybe the man had given up, or maybe the stormy roads kept him away. Days turned to weeks, and the world outside slowly forgot about Lydia Moore. On the ranch, life found a gentle rhythm. She laughed sometimes now, real laughter that filled the quiet rooms. Thomas found himself smiling more too. They worked side by side, and though no words were spoken about the future, something unspoken grew between them. Something steady, like the roots of the old oak tree near the barn. One evening, as the sky turned orange over the valley, Lydia stood on the porch watching the sun sink behind the hills. Thomas came up beside her, wiping his hands on a rag. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked softly. She looked at him for a long time before answering. "I did," she said, "but I think I already found where I belong." He nodded slowly, a faint smile on his lips. "Then this house ain't just mine anymore," he said quietly. As the light faded, the wind carried the scent of the plains and clean, wild, endless. The ranch, once silent and lonely, now held the sound of two lives mending in peace. The man who had lived too long in solitude, and the woman who had been left in the mud had found each other under the storm's shadow. And though the West was still a hard place for that small corner of it, there was warmth again, the kind that no wind could ever take away.